Hello, my name is Fox and you're watching Den of Fools. Let's jump right in. Games Workshop have now released their balanced dataslate, which is the last we will see in 9th edition. They have made a significant number of changes, but unfortunately, they have not released a full win rate for each faction, so we cannot do an exact comparison to our stats. Having said that, in the MetaWatch video, they did provide some win rates, and DW stated that they were recorded over 100,000 games since the start of Ark of Omen. Just a note on the data, we have recorded just over 60,000 games in Ark so far, which to us confirms our earlier theory that they have a much larger data pool. They also called out a number of factions individually, in some cases explaining why they have made certain changes. Let's go through the changes for each faction and see if they are justified on our stats. Perhaps the headline nerf from this dataslate is to the Dark Angels. GW state they have them at a win rate of 59%, where we have them at 57.3%. This is relatively close, and we think that GW are clearly justified in nerfing the Dark Angels. They are the best performing faction in Ark so far. GW have not held back, removing the big durability boost from the Inner Circle rule. Now their Terminators are no longer only wounded on a 4+, so I'd expect to see far less of them in games. Apart from that, they have not made any other changes to the Dark Angels, so it will be interesting to see if the other ways to play them, such as the Raven Wing, remain just as strong. They did make changes to the Space Marine secondary, Codex Warfare, meaning that you can no longer score the full 15 points in a single doctrine. This is mainly a nerf to Iron Hands and the Dark Angels, who are racking up the points in their Devastator doctrines. It will mean these chapters score much less points overall, but so will every other Space Marine chapter. The Iron Hands will still be just as potent in-game, so it'll be interesting to see how this change affects them in particular. Perhaps they will move ahead of the Dark Angels to become the undisputed strongest Space Marine chapter, as they currently have a win rate of 56.3%. As our stats show, a lot of the Space Marine chapters are struggling, and even GW mentioned that the Death Watch and Blood Angels in particular needed some help. The Death Watch have a win rate of 37.3%, so we're certainly in need of a buff. They are the worst performing of the chapters of their own supplement, so perhaps it was a bit easier to help the Death Watch. They did this by buffing their unique secondary and chapter tactic. The Death Watch can now choose any combat doctrine at the start of the battle round, and the secondary is now easier to score. While this should definitely help the Death Watch, I am unsure about by how much. We'll have to wait and see what the stats say. The Death Watch are not the worst performing chapter, that is unfortunately the Imperial Fists, who have struggled throughout the entire edition. They currently have a win rate of 28.6%, showing they are desperately in need of some buffs. They have, however, received a nerf, as have all Space Marines, now that Codex Warfare is more difficult to score. For me, this confirms what we suspected, that GW are not going to fully support every chapter in 10th edition by simply ignoring the vast majority of chapters with this dataslate. I will admit, it is difficult to balance so many different sub-factions, which all have their own unique rules. Perhaps it is not surprising that GW are focusing on Space Marines as an overall faction in 10th edition, although I do wonder what's going to happen to the more divergent chapters, such as my personal favourite chapter, the Blood Angels, who didn't actually get any buffs, even though they were mentioned by GW. We have the Genestealer cult at a win rate of 54.7%, which puts them second overall. GW had them first in their last MetaWatch article where we got the full win rate breakdown, so it is perhaps inevitable they would get a nerf. They have received quite a significant nerf, with their auto-include secondary Brood Swarm now much harder to score. As we saw with the Ark of Omen changes to the Necrons, nerfs to secondary objectives can have a big impact on the performance of a faction. It'll be interesting to see how well the Genestealer cults will do after this change. I'm sure they will drop away from the very top, but we will have to wait and see to find out by how much. We have the Custodes as the third most popular faction in Ark so far, with a win rate of 51.7%. They perhaps are not the strongest faction, but they may be one of these factions GW see as taking advantage of the nerfs to other factions. They have only received a small nerf to their stratagems, meaning you cannot use their transhuman rule and their stratagem to turn off rerolls on the same unit at the same time. It's only a small change, so it'll be interesting to see what impact it has on their win rate overall. The Guard were described as mid-table by GW, and we currently have them at 52.7% and the second most popular faction in Ark so far. They do perform well at big tournaments as GW stated, giving the example of the Guard list that won Adepticon as a high-performing list for the faction. If you want to see that list, check out our Adepticon tournament spotlight. GW have gone in with the nerfs for the Guard, even though they are not over a win rate of 55%. They are considered one of the strongest factions. Perhaps GW were worried that they would move up the table with other factions being nerfed. The Kazakin combo has been capped at 6 mortal wounds, which honestly probably should have been that way in the first place. The Finial relic I always struggle pronouncing has also been nerfed. We saw it in every Guard list, which was getting into the top 3 of tournaments in our spotlights, so perhaps a nerf to the relic was due, and it still helps with those pesky damage caps. It'll be interesting to see how well the Astra Militarum perform after the changes. Personally, I think they will still be one of the stronger armies. As we have been saying for a number of weeks, the Thousand Sons really did need a buff, having a win rate of 37.5% in Arc so far. I speculated in an earlier video that perhaps we might see them regain the Armour of Contempt rule, but maybe that was just wishful thinking from a person who just started a Thousand Sons army. We do not see any direct changes to Thousand Sons, we instead see a change to the Abhor the Witch secondary. It is moved into the Purge the Enemy section, meaning you can't take this and another one such as Assassinate. Unfortunately, we don't think this will actually help Thousand Sons a huge amount. It will make it slightly less punishing for them, however, it doesn't make it any easier for them to score points themselves. Our data will reveal how effective this change is in the coming weeks, however, I'm not holding my breath. GW did mention they were doing it to help the Grey Knights as well, who we have at a win rate of 46.4%. We think that the change to the secondary makes a bit more sense for the Grey Knights. It will buff them slightly, but they are not outside of the Goldilocks zone, so didn't really need a big buff in the first place. The Tower currently on a win rate of 45.7%, so are in the Goldilocks zone. GWF seemed to give them a rather big buff, returning the core keyword to broadside battlesuits. Regardless as to whether this change was needed or not, as my very first 40k army, I can't say I'm displeased with the buff. I suspect that it will be a significant boost, with broadside seen play again, especially in Taucep lists. I expect to see them climb up the win rate rankings, although perhaps not to the very top. The Drukhari on a win rate of 44.9%, so for us it's not that surprising that they've been given a small buff in this data slate. The Talos on Crones have the core keyword returned, with the previous nerfs remaining. This should be a reasonable power increase to the faction, and in any event, should push them into the Goldilocks zone. We have the Tyranids on a win rate of 41.6%, so they were definitely in need of some buffs. GW has obliged by removing some of their previous nerfs. First of all, they have removed the restriction on Hive Tyrants and their synaptic imperatives. No longer do they have to be your warlord, and if they die, the ability still works. Hive Tyrants were seeing a lot of play anyway, so it will most likely only be a small buff to the faction overall. They have also allowed Tyranids to choose a Hive Fleet adaptation before the game again, which definitely helps the faction. I personally like this rule, as the Tyranids are supposedly constantly adapting, so having the ability to counter opponents by choosing your trait is a cool rule to see return. We'll have to wait and see if these changes help Tyranids get back towards the middle of the table. The overall best performing faction in Arc so far, Chaos Demons, received not a single nerf. It was mentioned by GW that they have a win rate of 56%, so it's a bit surprising they didn't get any changes. We have them at a win rate of 54.8%, so technically they are just under the 55% benchmark that GW used to decide if a faction is too strong. Having said that, I think they may have just cemented their place at the top of the Arcs of Omen win rates. GW told us the World Eaters have a win rate of 55% according to their data. We have them at 53.2%, so again technically they didn't need a nerf. I do think that they will rise up the rankings now that the factions above, and even some below, have received nerfs. I wonder if they will be competing with Chaos Demons for the top spot overall. On the other end of the scale, we have a number of factions below 45%, which didn't get any buffs. The Sisters of Battle are on a win rate of 44.9%, so perhaps we can let GW off for not making any changes, as they round up to a 45% win rate. Adeptus Mechanicus are a bit further down, with a win rate of 43.7%. They could have done with some buffs, as they have been struggling as a faction for a while. Unfortunately for them, GW decided that a change wasn't necessary. Perhaps a small point buff for Admet would have been more appropriate, however, as we know, GW don't do them in the balanced data slate. Perhaps the biggest overall loser is Chaos Space Marines. We have them on a win rate of 40.6%, marginally keeping out of the red zone. They have received no buffs, so their fortunes won't change, and unfortunately, they may well be compete with the Thousand Sons to stay off the bottom spot. If you enjoyed our content, please subscribe, check out one of the videos on screen, and consider using our affiliate links in the description. Thank you for watching.